Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you're hearing us today. It's a pleasure to be here with Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. It's always thrilling. I'm always so pleased, Nicole, to talk to you, you know, to be around and see some of the fantastic work that you've done, not only in your office, but in other places before.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. And what you're
And
not saying, Pamela, is that we have worked together before, and it's so exciting to see what you're doing at No More, and all of just thinking about work together over the years and how things have changed and are progressing. So it's really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
no, thank you for that. I like how I feel like some of us in the sector in general, and this is global, like grow up together almost in generations of work. And you're doing such fantastic work in the commissioner's office. Some of us leading non for profits, but it's great to know in a way that you have a community that you grew up with. Um, and that's why anybody who's hearing us, I really recommend to keep those networks, to really take care of them, because it's a career path, it's a life choice, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And you never quite know exactly where it's headed. But it is about staying kind of in touch with what you feel is really important for change that's needed, and really turning your time and attention in that direction. And inevitably you stay connected with these, amazing people like you and others working in this movement. And everyone may gravitate into slightly different ways of addressing violence against women and girls and domestic abuse, but there's so much to tune into. And I think you're exactly right. The networks. In my role now, just knowing, one of my first questions always is kind of what's happening locally on the ground, at the grassroots, because that is exactly what I need to know to do a good job in my current role. And I think my respect for that comes from obviously having been there myself and being, on the ground working in domestic abuse services and innovative efforts and multi kind of you bringing in lots of partners, and really trying to have more systemic change. So not just crisis intervention, but all of the systemic change that we need in our society. So you build up a lot of knowledge over time, but it always seems to be rooted. If it's good, it'll be rooted in the kind of what's happening and what's working at the local level.
And it's nice to do with a group of people that are also taking other career kind of pathways, and you can see what they're doing and model also. But for all of those that don't have the pleasure of knowing you, as I do, let me kind of just talk a little bit more about you and a bit of your bio. So Nicole began her career at the Alabama State Coalition Against Domestic Violence in the United States. In 1999, she came to London as an independent domestic violence advocate at Advance, one of the first advocacy services in the UK. In 2000, she began working at Standing Together Against Domestic Violence, focusing on embedding the coordinated community response to domestic abuse here in the UK. From 2002 to 2013, Nicole held a number of senior leadership positions at highly respected organizations, and in 2013, she returned to Standing Together as their CEO and oversaw substantial growth and headed up strategy development and expanded the influence of this organization. Since her appointment to the role of Domestic Abuse Commissioner of the UK in 2019, Nicole has put her 20 plus years of experience in domestic abuse policy and intervention to work, driving improvements to transform the response to domestic abuse in England and Wales. And I can't, after reading all of that, and it probably feels like, so much, and I have the pleasure to seeing that. Can I just ask you a quick question before we get into the more formal stuff, which is, what drove you to work in this area?
Originally, what drove me to work.
Yeah.
I was at the university, I would have been kind of your typical political science kind of student, very interested in politics, interested in probably thinking I might become a lawyer. There were people, you do a lot with in your family. Um, and I then did an internship in my last year of university at a rape crisis center this is in the US. And I think that really changed my entire career trajectory, because or really just does, what I wanted to do with my time is a more probably accurate way of putting it. I don't think I was thinking in terms of career, but I volunteered to accompany young people into court. That was some of what I did during that internship. And what I realized was that and these were sexual abuse cases, and the vast majority of the perpetrators were someone the child knew within their family. Very often, maybe a mom's boyfriend, for example. And I think it really opened my eyes to this whole world of work and experience that I just had not seen before. And I kind of dove straight in. I spent my weekends, volunteering in the ER, what we would call in the UK the A&E, where rape survivors would come in to have kind of a specialized, kind of like a sexual assault referral center, but I'm sure these are called various things in different places, but where they would come in and get the forensic examination, but also the support. I then came back to my campus, and a lot of my friends started to say to me about experiences they had. And it was, again, it was a huge transformation in terms of it just opened my eyes to people I thought I knew very, very well, who I'd known for years in some cases. And because they knew I knew a little bit about this, having been away from campus, started telling me about their experiences. So, of course, I've grown up in the same misogyny and everything else, but I hadn't experienced that type of abuse myself. But in a strange way, I think because I hadn't, when I was forced to look at those things and see in my own friendship group and see in my own kind of day-to-day early work experience, I just could never, there was never an option to look another way. I mean, there was so much work to do. There's so much to improve. And I think any job I've had ever since then, I've had that feeling. There's always, a bit of progress, but so much more to do. And it just has kept me very much committed for all these years.
It's interesting. We've kept on saying in these sessions around working in an area that breaks your heart is that if you feel so deeply for an issue, be it because you were a survivor or not, but that you just find that injustice. It could be from, animal support services to climate change to domestic abuse, then, you're probably in the right career pathway. Anyway, I would love to talk a little bit more about your office, and I would love to know what has it implemented to address domestic abuse, and particular with a focus on tech abuse.
Yeah, so I know the audience is quite international, so I'll take one moment just to say what the office is. So the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, and my remit is England and Wales. And the role was created in a piece of legislation here in the UK called the Domestic Abuse Act, which received royal assent a couple of years ago. So it's a relatively new role. I was appointed slightly prior to the legislation coming to fruition, essentially, because it wasn't the only thing created in the legislation. There were many, many aspects of that particular piece of legislation. But in creating the role, I was appointed as a designate first, so that when everything did pass, I would be ready and I would have some of the team built up. I'm a public appointee, so I'm not, I often say this really at the start of anything, is I'm not a government minister. In other words, I'm not party political, but my role is created in legislation, and we do have some powers in the office. So we're able to seek information from public bodies. In the legislation, it says exactly which range of public bodies, which is pretty comprehensive, have to cooperate if we ask for information. That's not to help one particular person. In fact, I'm not allowed to do that, but I can seek information to really drive progress, essentially, to make sure that whether it's having to do with housing or health or criminal justice or the family courts or our work in pensions arrangements across any part of government, we're able to seek information and really drive that momentum for change. And coupled with that, I'm able to make recommendations to those public bodies that must be responded to publicly within 56 days. So the whole idea is essentially I think it was a way to recognize that even though we've made progress in England and Wales, we have a long way to go. And to have a commissioner and a team behind a commissioner in place that has those powers, it's kind of geared to really make progress and momentum for change. So we work across government in all departments. We work kind of nationally, obviously, but also all the way through to the local level, because so much, particularly in England and Wales, that really impacts domestic abuse. There are opportunities at the local level to create the funding or to use funding given for domestic abuse services. There's just so many decisions, I suppose, made at the local level that's equally as important as having the national view. And so some of the reports that we've published to Parliament have been about mapping of services, domestic abuse services specifically. We're in the late summer, early autumn, publishing a mapping of services for children and domestic abuse, just to give you an example, like where we're really trying to bring information together that says, not so much as a directory, but to say this isn't enough. These are where the gaps are, and this is exactly government where you or any other funders can, and trusts and foundations play a role. So we do that. Sometimes we pick very specific subjects like family court, for example. We've been very, very active in family court, migrant services for migrant survivors, which sadly in England and Wales, people who have certain status in the country or visa status that may be highly dependent on what kind of domestic abuse services you can access. So we tend to kind of work across on a daily basis across opportunities in government, but then we'll drill down very specifically into key priorities that victims and survivors of domestic abuse are telling us are particular problems for them, or where we can see the use of our powers really having a good effect. And to some degree, we're doing that with online safety. I know we're needing to get to that subject, but it's early days, I would say. We've just had an Online Safety Act here in the UK, and we're kind of early in understanding exactly what that means. But my office was named in the legislation as a statutory consultee, which essentially means that we must be consulted with by our regulator, which is in England and Wales is called Ofcom.
And that's a big step forward to really be able to have that input there, at that level when those decisions are being made. And there's a lot of conversation around future proofing legislation, especially for violence against women and girls. So I, for sure that's interesting. I want to kind of go back in a way, because I know you and I have been here for a while, and it would be kind of great to talk a little bit about the landscape, how technology come and influence domestic abuse victims, since in a way, since it really was some of this technology was introduced, right? I want to say since probably we started working here in England, which probably parallels that time. But what are some of the changes that you have seen?
Yeah, well, I think you're right that as soon as you see technology introduced, or the internet, social media, you can see exactly how perpetrators exploit that. And so And we have some emerging evidence, which I think is quite solid, from some of our service providers that have published reports in England and Wales where they've started to unpick and really be more assertive about the extent to which technology, use of tracking devices, social media, the whole interaction of all technology, I suppose, has been used to further abuse. So it's a increasingly we can see this real crossover between online and offline harms and the interaction between them. So there'll be reports that I'm sure you'll talk about today in many places and many countries, but here there's been some really great reports that some of our service providers like Refuge have done, which show quite startling statistics, not unsurprising, but should startle us. The idea that 83% of people who've had threats of sharing indecent images, for example, which again in the Domestic Abuse Act I described earlier is now a criminal offence in the UK, that when that is the case, you can see huge percentages of offline abuse, sexual violence, a fourth of the time for those same people, for example. So there's a lot that should point us in the direction that if you're experiencing abuse offline, you're going to be experiencing it online, or you'll be experiencing technology-based or fueled abuse. So tracking devices. There's a lot that our helplines and service providers have had to do in the UK to really keep up with emerging technologies. And there's been some real kind of early but significant investment in upskilling domestic abuse services so that they can keep up with some of that and can give good advice, but also give good advice to each other. And I suppose the flip side is there's been some real tech for good. We've used the use of kind of online chat, online kind of ways of seeking help and support. I mean, obviously there's the good and the bad in the mix, but sure. One of the things that I think is really important, and when I think about our role with Ofcom and thinking about online safety, is we also have to recognize exactly what you said, the context that we're in. Do we have an excellent police response and consistent police response in England and Wales? Not yet. Do we have services that in our helplines nationally in England and Wales, but also the services provided, are they feeling as equipped as they want to be in terms of giving the right support for online abuse and harm? There's some really there's great development and green shoots, but we're not quite there yet. So there's a lot to do to kind of lay the groundwork for our online safety bill to be as effective, our online safety act to be as effective as it ought to be.
And to the best of your knowledge, are there collaborations happening with tech companies and other stakeholders that have interest to discuss these topics?
I think it needs, I think in light of the Online Safety Act, I would expect that to have a huge uptick now. I mean, there's been some of that happening, I would say, particularly examples where you have kind of maybe quite short-term efforts between tech companies or social media companies and some of the domestic abuse services, a bit of investment. But I would say now, I would fully expect to see quite a step change in that direction. We now have legislation. I'll tell you, like, as a good example of things that we really need to unpick are, named in our Online Safety Act are specific offenses: stalking and harassment, threats to share indecent images, and coercion and controlling behavior. And that is slightly different from other countries because in the UK, we have, or in most jurisdictions in the UK, we have coercion and controlling behavior as a criminal offense. So in England and Wales, for example, that has been in place since about 2014. And the Domestic Abuse Act, which created my role, which we talked about earlier, further amended that so that coercion and control post separation, after the relationship is ended, is applicable. So if you think of that in the online space, you've got a country here that has coercion and controlling behavior, that pattern of behavior, which could be online and offline, as a criminal offense, and layer on top of that it being specifically named in our Online Safety Act. It definitely gives us a lot of work to do for tech companies, for those who are in the way they're responsible to communicate and respond. It gives a lot of challenge to Ofcom in terms of how they properly regulate that. But also, I think of course, given my background, one of the first ports of call that victims and survivors will come to would be local services that they know of. The police, for example. I've asked England in England and Wales, who are the first people you would think to speak to about abuse, and survivors have told me it's the police and it's health services. So that's the avenue, or those frontline services are the avenue often people will get to the helplines and the domestic abuse services. So if you can think of all of those stakeholders, there's so much work to be done, so that what might look quite harmless online, which actually is part of a coercion and controlling behavior, how do you make sense of that, and what is a reasonable expectation of what we would want to see done, and how do we go about understanding that? And I would say we're climbing the mountain, but we are certainly not there yet, and there's a lot of work to do. And Ofcom is consulting on that right now, in fact. So even though we've got the legislation, there's still quite a lot in terms of the implementation to go.
And I hear the challenges that you're having there. What do you think are the challenges for small grassroots organizations regarding this? Because we can, that's partially why we're preparing this event, right? Because there is so much lack of information. But yeah, what do you think that might be challenges for other stakeholders?
I think it's a challenge to have a reasonable expectation of what must be done or what ought to be done, when you inevitably, it is absolutely certain to me that anyone who is providing support and advice and advocacy for survivors of domestic abuse will already, and for many years now, be coming across the tech-based or online abuse. And I think the great frustration is, what people in those services would have found is that they don't get very far in addressing those harms. They try to report it, nothing happens. They try to get things taken down, it doesn't happen. And there's almost like this feeling of there's nothing to do about that. It's greatly frustrating. And I do worry about that, because now we have, in some cases, in some countries, legislation, but how do you operationalize that? So I suppose the advice I would give to smaller organizations is to, through Know More and through networks, there's a lot to learn from each other about how we navigate through some of that. And having very active conversations with the police and key stakeholders about how that's going. One of the things, for example, we're coming across here, I held, and I think maybe you were there, I think you certainly were there, Pamela, a meeting of all of our helplines in England and Wales. And I was really struck by, there's a lot to ask of services and helplines about gathering data and information, because they are obviously set up to give direct advice and support. They're not set up to gather data. But yet when we have something like the Online Safety Act, the first thing Ofcom want to know about is the data. They want to know the evidence, and they want to be an evidence-led regulator, which I understand that. But a lot of the places, like smaller services who have that information, don't necessarily gather it in a way that helps when you come to this point at which you're trying to make sense of how you regulate properly. So there is a lot we can learn from each other. And I think having really country to country debates. I mean, one of the things I'm very much interested in is what's going on in other countries.
Mhm.
Being in a role where, I mean, obviously I'm not the only voice, but I can have meetings with Ofcom. Um, my office is named as that kind of role as a statutory consultee. There's a lot we have to learn. So we're not where we all need to be, but we certainly need to be talking and sharing. And one of the things I can see in our helplines and in our services in England and Wales is those who have been out in front a bit, who've had the advantage of having some funding. Sometimes that funding has been from tech companies,
Mhm.
like organizations like Refuge. They have a lot to share with others and really enable others to do well and learn what they've learned. So it is a lot of, it's very much about keeping at it and making incremental changes despite the fact the problem is quite complex.
Nicole, just to kind of finish, the majority of people logging in are grassroots organizations, international NGOs. They're kind of frontline workers, activists. We're hearing these conversations throughout, what's happening in different parts of the world around kind of tech abuse. If you had to, and I know this is kind of, difficult, but if you can give us one action that you believe we should all be taking or starting to take regarding tech abuse, what would that be?
Oh, I would say this for tech abuse, but for many aspects of our response to domestic abuse, which is it is daunting. A lot of this is quite and is seems very complex, but I think with anything within your realm, whether it's local or more national or international, it is about um thinking about who it is you need to practically speak to and talk to, and convening the right people in the right space for you and your organization to think about what you can practically do right now and the here and the now. And that will change according to who you are and where you work and what you're doing. Um, but in doing that, also, preparing for that in a way and understanding the best of it, the best of what you can as to what's out there, not trying to recreate the wheel
Mhm.
necessarily, taking the best of what but bringing that kind of operationally in a meaningful way for the stakeholders you will be able to influence and be able to talk to and think about what can be done there. There's a lot going on in this space, and to reassure you as commissioner, and England and Wales, I'm much clearer on certain aspects of our response to domestic abuse than others. The online space, I feel like we have so much to learn and so much we need to work on together. So it will feel daunting for anyone, including me. And what I've learned with this so far is keeping up with and trying to be as proactive, even if it feels quite incremental, keeping at it and making sure that what's going well for victims is really in the center of things, as
Mhm.
well as what's going wrong. And with anything, we can get very frustrated as to what's going wrong, but we have to be really clear, to pay attention to both things. What can we do better? What is the reality of where we're failing collectively, and keeping that very much at the center of those conversations.
And with that, there's a process of hearing you. There's of convening and exercising your area of influence, where we need to have a bit of faith that if we do our thing correctly, there are other people out there that are also kind of pushing the barrier, right? That it's not only you, because if not, you're absolutely right, right? It feels daunting and it feels like
Yeah.
we'll never be able to kind of tackle something like this.
And can I just, for those of you who work in services at the local level, one of the things I can reassure you about is that your expertise is really needed at the table. I find this I find this a lot in my role, where people who you think understand domestic abuse and what that entails don't always understand it. And when you think people who understand the responses to domestic abuse and what really happens in terms of how things operationally, how things play out, kind of the difference between passing a law and if the law is implemented, that kind of thing. Not all people understand that as well as you do. And
Mhm.
so feeling confident in those spaces to say, I'm working on the front line and advising people every day. And it's really important for me to tell you what really goes on, because I suppose coming into this role, just reflecting from the domestic abuse sector, I mean, I was a chief executive, but I still walked into meetings kind of assuming people had a much greater understanding than they did sometimes. It's, you know, so I think it is just remembering you sit on a lot of truth, and you're representing a lot of individual survivors, and the way that you, just the experience that you have, and making room and helping survivors and victims themselves speak for themselves. I think that's a really important role you play in all of this as well.
I love that. I love that because yeah, we know that the higher you go in your organization, as much as you're doing other things and you're giving a lot of voice, the more you're just not connected to that daily. And I know that some of my best learning was when I was a refuge manager, right? And I still take some of that learning today to be able to do what I do, but I'm not doing it every day. So you have to rely on people who are there doing that frontline work
Yeah.
and have the best of the knowledge to what's happening now too, because then some of our experiences might be 12 years ago, 14 years ago. And well,
Yeah.
in my time, the worry was that you would post something in Facebook, and that was like the worst thing that you could do if you were in a refuge, right? There are so much things now that yeah, we need everybody on the table. It doesn't matter the grade. So thank you so much for this, Nicole. It's always so great to see you, to talk to you. Such a blessing to have this position here in the UK. And I just wish that there were many other of these type of positions created throughout the world. So I'm sure you're a beacon and an example of that. So thank you very much for being with us today. And
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And I'll be watching the whole of this conference. It looks like a great agenda. So thanks for having me.
thank you very much.